In the third volume of his account of the founding of the United States, future President Theodore Roosevelt argued for the necessity and justness of violence in the establishment of the white man's rule. Although his book told the story of the frontier campaigns of the newly independent American nation during the final years of the 18th century, Roosevelt drew explicit parallels to the conquest by white settlers elsewhere in the world. The rude, fierce settler who drives the savage from the land lays all civilized mankind under a debt to him. American and Indian, Boer and Zulu, Cossack and Tartar, New Zealander and Maori, in each case, the victor, horrible though many of his deeds are, has laid deep the foundations for the future greatness of a mighty people. The consequences of struggles for territory between civilized nations seem small by comparison. Looked at from the standpoint of the ages, it is of little moment whether Lorraine is part of Germany or of France, whether the northern Adriatic cities pay homage to Austrian Kaiser or Italian king. But it is of incalculable importance that America, Australia, and Siberia should pass out of the hands of their red, black, and yellow aboriginal owners and become the heritage of the dominant world races. This was more than just a historical narrative of a bygone era. Roosevelt was comparing criticism of the treatment of Native Americans in the U.S. just 4 years after the Wounded Knee Massacre with contemporary British liberals who were speaking out against Cecil Rhodes' brutal conquest of present-day Zimbabwe. The homestaying Englishman of Britain grudges to the Afrikander his conquest of Matabeleland, and so the homestaying American of the Atlantic states dislikes to see the Western miners and cattlemen win for the use of their people the Sioux hunting grounds. Nevertheless, it is the men actually on the borders of the longed-for ground, the men actually in contact with the savages, who in the end shape their own destinies. Readers were given to understand that the real American, and by extension the real white man, was not the soft-hearted East Coast liberal, but the sturdy figure of the Indian fighting pioneer, a role that Roosevelt had himself performed so effectively earlier in his career. Violence and masculinity, race and empire were all intimately connected in this vision of manifest destiny. Just a few years later, in 1898, Roosevelt had become one of the strongest proponents of an American intervention in Cuba, ostensibly aimed at putting an end to Spanish oppression of the local population. The resulting war with Spain, however, led to a significant expansion of U.S. overseas territories, including the prospect of the annexation of the Philippines. It was at this point that the British author Rudyard Kipling wrote the famous poem The White Man's Burden, exhorting the United States to accept its moral responsibility and, as Britain had done throughout its colonies, civilize the Philippines. Kipling knew Roosevelt personally and had sent the future president a copy of the poem in late 1898 before its formal publication. Although Roosevelt was unimpressed by the poetry, he recognized that the message made good sense from the expansion standpoint. On February 4, 1899, the same day that U.S. soldiers opened fire on Filipino troops in Manila, thus kicking off the Philippine-American War, people back home could, for the first time, read Kipling's poem, which had just been published in McClure's. By that point, Spain had officially ceded the Philippines to the United States, which launched its imperialist project under the guise of benevolent assimilation. There was, however, nothing benevolent about the brutal war fought over the next few years against Filipino nationalists who had been promised liberation from Spanish rule, but instead found one colonial ruler simply replaced by another. Despite the deeply entrenched sense of exceptionalism underpinning American identity, it turned out that manifest destiny and the white man's burden were merely variations on the same theme. Kipling's incongruous concept of the savage wars of peace echoed the exact sentiment expressed by Roosevelt and perfectly captured the deadly logic of Western imperialism at the turn of the 20th century, which both prescribed and justified unrestrained violence in the name of progress.